We're going to be talking today about the revival of jazz that happened in San Francisco. Let me take you back to the year 1938. The jazz of the New Orleans style of the Roaring '20s was really dead at that point. If you were a jazz fan in 1938, you really had to just listen to records. That's about all you could hear. Joe King Oliver, he was a janitor at a bowling alley in Savannah, Georgia. Jelly Roll Morton was trying to revive his fame in Los Angeles, but failing badly. Bunk Johnson was driving a truck in the rice fields of Louisiana. And Kid Ory worked in a post office in Los Angeles. The only one that really survived that era was Louis Armstrong, who of course got by on his personality and his ability to play all kinds of different music. The stars of that day, 1938, were named Goodman, Shaw, Dorsey, and Miller. Well, about 1938, an amazing thing happened in San Francisco. A young man named Lou Waters. Well, let me give you a little background. He was born in 1911 in Santa Cruz. He took up the trumpet at age 11 and knew very early that he wanted to make music his career. So he took a lot of jobs as a young man with cruise ships and traveling dance bands and so forth. In the late 30s, he was in San Francisco playing in a dance gig and started to meet young guys like himself who were really sad about the lack of good Dixieland music around. So he decided to form a band in his spare time, and he got 5 or 6 guys that thought like he did. So they started a band. They found a rehearsal hall that was the back room of a tavern up in Oakland, up in the hills above Oakland, called the Big Bear Tavern. And this is where he formed his band. He got them ready to play. He called his band the Yerba Buena Jazz Band. Yerba Buena was the very first name of the location of San Francisco when the Spaniards arrived. Okay, so he called it the Yerba Buena Jazz Band, and he had with him the trombonist Turk Murphy, trumpeter Bob Scobie, clarinetist Bob Helm, pianist Wally Rose, and he'd fill in other things when he could. Lou Waters was a real perfectionist. He wanted the 2 trumpet sound that made King Oliver's music so wonderful. In order to teach his musicians the sound that he wanted, he wrote out every piece and every part for every piece. He didn't want them to read the music on the stand when they were performing, but he wanted them to learn exactly what he wanted to hear. But he never had a reading band. He got a big break in the spring of 1940. He was hired to play at a little tiny place on a little tiny street in downtown San Francisco. The club was called the Dawn Club. The street was called Annie Street, and a little tiny, almost like an alley, right behind the Palace Hotel, just off of Market Street. And they would bring the crowds in with tunes like this. Here's a Jelly Roll Morton tune called the Froggy Moore Rag. Well, the band was a big success at the Dawn Club. The people in San Francisco who loved this kind of music, it was the only place to go. The only place you could hear this stuff. And then what happened in December of 1941? Pearl Harbor happened. They all enlisted in the services and kind of spread out. So there went the band in the Dawn Club for a while. Lou Waters went into the Navy and spent the whole war on a supply ship called the USS Antigua. They were taking spare parts to Pearl Harbor from San Francisco and then returning with wounded GIs. While on board, I don't think he had many friends on board because he spent a lot of time in his cabin writing music for his new band. And we're privileged to have some of those charts and picked up on some of that music. Here's one he wrote in honor of the ship he was on called the Antigua Blues. Well, of course, the war ended in 1945 and all the boys returned, anxious to get back to their gig at the Dawn Club. which they did, and of course it again became the center of jazz in the great city of San Francisco during those days. Here's a tune that needs a little explanation, written by Louis Armstrong and Percy Venable. It's called The Irish Black Bottom, and Louis got to thinking in the late 20s, with all the dance crazes going on, the Lindy Hop and the Charleston and the Black Bottom, and these dances were being exported all over the world, and they're becoming quite the rage in the Roaring 20s. And he got to thinking about what it would happen if the dance craze of the U.S. in the 20s took over the traditional centuries-long traditions of the foreign countries. And he wrote a tune called The Irish Black Bottom. Well, the band was doing great at the Dawn Club through 1946, but at the end of that year, they got into money troubles at the Dawn Club. They had to let the band go. That was a real disaster. But Lou wanted his own place, so he didn't have to worry about landlords and so forth. And they looked around the Bay Area and they found an old warehouse over in El Cerrito. Those of you in San Francisco area know El Cerrito, just north of Berkeley, on the eastern side of the bay. And it was actually an old performing spot for Sally Rand. You remember Sally Rand and her fan dances? She was very hot during the 1939 exposition in San Francisco. And she played there for several years after that, and then it became empty, and Lou and the boys scraped some money together and bought this place. It was huge, 10,000 square foot, but it needed a lot of work, so they pitched in and they repainted it. The Turk did all the plumbing and all the wiring. Lou made a kitchen. There was no kitchen before. He wanted to serve food, and so he made a kitchen, and they named it Hambone Kelly's for some reason. They opened the doors in June of 1947 and immediately was very successful with a tune like this one, another one written by Lou Waters on board the USS Antigua in 1944. This has a strange little history to it. Lou was a really intelligent guy, very curious about everything, science and everything around him. And he had seen as a child, he'd seen some kind of a picture of a sage hen dancing a mating dance, and he was fascinated by the dancing that this little bird was doing. So he wrote a tune, he called it the Sage Hen Strut. In the middle of the 1800s, there was a businessman whose name was Joshua Abraham Norton. He was a millionaire, big man around town. And then he decided to put all his money into Peruvian rice, believe it or not, and he lost everything. So he came back to San Francisco as a pauper, and it affected his mind a little too. He was a little crazy, not a little. He declared himself the Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. He wore a grand uniform with lots of buttons and epaulets and all that good stuff, a tall hat, and he'd wander around San Francisco, I'm sure getting a lot of free drinks and food, and preaching on the street corner about all the wonderful ideas he had. And of course his name was Emperor Norton after that. Well, he died broke in 1880, and supposedly he was so popular that about 30,000 people attended his funeral. One of the crazier ideas he had was that he thought that they should build a bridge across San Francisco Bay from San Francisco to Oakland. Now everybody knows that couldn't be done. It's too deep water and too far. But that's what he thought it ought to be. And that was his hunch. And the Lou Waters loved this story, and he wrote a tune called Emperor Norton's Hunch. Well, the band had great success over at Hambone Kelly's on the east side of the bay. It was a big place. They drew a lot of folks. They came and ate dinner and listened to music all night, and they were very successful there. Lou ran the kitchen. He was a chef by his hobby was cooking. So he'd take over the kitchen and put out wonderful food for the folks. And it was a great place. I guess it was big enough so some of the band even lived on the premises there at Hambone Kelly's. So they had a good run at Hambone's, and they always finished each evening with this W.C. Handy tune called the Friendless Blues. So the band was big. The Yerba Buena Jazz Band was very big in the late 40s in the San Francisco area. But in 1949, Turk Murphy decided he wanted to go out on his own, and so he left the band in late 49. Bob Scobie thought that was a good idea, so he left in the early 50s. And Lou kept the band going with new people for about a year. And then he got tired of it, and he closed up Hambone Kelly's. And he stopped playing his horn altogether. He was always searching for new things to do, and he loved geology, and he started collecting gemstones, and he made that a hobby that turned into a business for him. And he also honed his skills as a chef. The only other time he played his horn was in 1963. It seems that PG&E, the big electric utility in California, said that they wanted to build a new nuclear plant right on the coast at Bodega Bay. Now, those of you who saw the Hitchcock movie, The Birds, know all about Bodega Bay, beautiful little town. And they wanted to put a nuclear plant right there. Well, it didn't make a whole lot of sense because that's exactly where the San Andreas Fault goes into the Pacific Ocean. So there was a huge cry, and Lou got caught up in that. He took up his horn. He actually wrote a tune called Blues Over Bodega, and the campaign was successful because, of course, they never built the nuclear plant. He continued to live in obscurity up in Central California, and he died in 1989. We're going to finish this set with a tune that they came up with while they were rehearsing at the Big Bear Tavern up in Oakland in the 40s, early 40s, called the Big Bear Stomp.